Hello and welcome to the show. Today we're asking, does rationality disprove naturalism? We're looking at the argument for God from reason. Max Baker-Hytch is a philosopher from Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. He believes that an atheist materialist account of reality can't make sense of our ability to reason, think and understand and make arguments. Alex O'Connor is a well-known online as the Cosmic Skeptic. It's an atheist YouTube channel where he regularly engages with arguments for God. He'll be responding to Max's challenge that the very reason and rationality that many atheists celebrate, in fact, points to God. So, Alex and Max, welcome along to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. Great
Pleasure to be here.
Alex, you've been on before.
That's right, a few times now.
Yeah, a few times.
I'm kind of losing count.
In our radio studio, usually.
Yeah, this is a nice development.
I've been able to witness your online profile grow and grow over that time. And of course, you're now a student at Oxford University, so there's a lot of stuff going on in your life. But it's great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be here too. I think it is a bit absurd that I'm being sat next to people who've actually finished their degrees and DPhils, and I'm just this lowly undergraduate who manages somehow to get across the table.
I think it speaks for the fact that you've grown a really interesting audience online who want to hear your perspectives on things, and I do appreciate you coming in to sort of, have a go opposite Max with just seeing what this argument is about. And I will be learning as well during this process. Max, you've your first time on the show.
Yeah.
This argument, how did you first come across it? And tell us a little bit, first of all, as well about what you do and your role as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'm tutor in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, and I'm on the philosophy faculty at Oxford. Been doing that job for nearly 4 years now. I did my doctorate in philosophy at Oxford, actually looking at Alvin Plantinga's epistemology, something that's probably been debated on this show a number of times. I know it has been debated on the show. So how did I come across this argument? I guess, I sort of picked up Lewis about, 10 years ago for the first time. Mere Christianity was the first thing of his I read, as is probably the case for many people, and then I picked up Miracles, which is the book where Lewis tries to develop this argument. And I have to say, I don't think he expounds the argument in a very clear and lucid way, because I think in general, whether or not we think his arguments are good, I think many people would agree he's quite a clear writer, but I think this argument takes a bit of unraveling, but I think it is a pretty interesting argument, and at least supplies some interesting material for discussion.
In a nutshell, maybe just give us a sense of what the argument is, and then just be interested in hearing what Lewis did with it. I know there was a famous episode when he was challenged on it by a contemporary philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, and obviously others have taken and developed it as well over that time.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to summarize the argument is actually with a quote from someone else, J.B.S. Haldane, who was a philosopher who influenced Lewis. But Lewis obviously thinks this is a very key passage, and I do kind of think it encapsulates the argument, and it just goes like this. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that doesn't make them sound logically, and hence I have no reasons for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. So, as I said, Lewis sort of tries to build this argument, and it gets sort of, there are certain nuances to the way he does that where I wouldn't follow him, but what
was this episode where he kind of, I think, presented this?
Yes.
I think Miracles, where he presents the argument, had been published at this point, and he sort of went to defend it in a kind of Socratic type dialogue with Elizabeth Anscombe. I guess this would be
that's right. So the original
1940s or 50s.
Yes, that's right. So the original version of Miracles was published in 1948, and it's actually surprisingly hard to get hold of the original version now. Lewis debated Elizabeth Anscombe, who's actually also a Christian. But she was quite critical of this argument, and Lewis tried to defend the argument, and there are various accounts of what happened, but it seems that Lewis felt he was kind of brought up short in that exchange, and that Anscombe had pointed to some quite serious flaws in the argument. But then Lewis went on to revise the argument, and it was published again, a revised version of Miracles in 1960, where he'd really tried to take on board Anscombe's criticisms. And actually there's an essay that Anscombe wrote much later in the 80s, quite a long time after Lewis died, where she reflects on how Lewis had changed the argument. And she kind of commends him and she said, I mean, she's very cautious in her wording, but she says it provides material for serious discussion, material which is genuinely problematic for naturalism.
Well, we'll come maybe to some of the ways in which it's been developed as well later on with people like Plantinga and so forth. But you're probably aware, obviously, Alex, that I've sort of employed my sort of take on this argument a little bit, both in when we sat down for a discussion on your podcast and in that dialogue I had with Stephen Woodford, Rationality Rules in Oxford as well. And I've always been quite influenced, actually. I remember actually in my gap year before going up to Oxford myself, reading Miracles and thinking, wow, I've never heard this, I've never seen this. It was like, as I said in the debate, a penny dropping moment for me, this argument, which for me, again, if I could summarize, it would be something along the lines of, if our thoughts are purely reducible ultimately to the activity of electrons and chemicals and atoms in the brain, there's nothing true or false about the activity of chemicals and electrons in the brain. There simply is cause and effect. There's a physical thing going on. And at what level do you then invest that with the trust of giving you something true, something reliable? Because it is ultimately, there's nothing true or false about one atom bumping into another atom. That at a very simple level is kind of where I sort of, the central thought that suddenly made me think, gosh, that's a really big problem for anyone who believes that everything is ultimately material. And we kind of traced that out a little bit, talking about determinism specifically when I came on your show, and why I felt that equally there were some issues around if we were all bound to believe the things we believe, what does that say for rationality and the way we come to arrive at our beliefs and so on?
I found it particularly interesting that because the first time we mentioned this was after taping one of your shows.
That's right.
And we kind of we stood just
at the door
talking about
leaving,
it.
I said, I'd love to have a debate with you.
Yeah, and I remember thinking about it, and then I had you on the podcast, and we only got to it near the end, didn't have much time, and then I asked you about it in the Q&A, but we never really got to sink our teeth into it. But I found it really interesting that one of the things that I want to sort of bring into this conversation is whether similar criticisms about the trust that we can have in reason and the legitimacy that we can afford it are also true of a religious worldview. And when you spoke about reading Miracles, and as you say, it was like the penny dropped, it just kind of washed you over with this kind of process of thought. And I remember thinking, but your criticism was that if your thought processes are determined not by your choices, not by what you are able to kind of consider for yourself, but just by kind of deterministic factors, then it isn't a rational process. Well, it's like every single decision you ever make, right? And as somebody who, as listeners might not be aware, doesn't believe in free will for a number of reasons, but like if you take the approach that I think is almost trivially true, that you can't choose to be convinced of things, right? You don't get to decide what convinces you. That when something kind of washes you over, like Miracles obviously did to you, that's essentially a deterministic process happening, right? It's just something that you had no control over, just a cause and effect, and suddenly your mind is convinced. And yet the thing that you're claiming to be convinced of by that process is that such processes cannot be rational. And I found that to be a strange irony.
Well, I don't want to repeat the debate at this point, but I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had there. It might be slightly different to what we're talking about today,
Yeah,
I
it's certainly
suspect,
separable.
because I think that's more about whether you need freedom to be able to look at the alternatives and come to a decision, or whether that is, if you like, just as much a determined process over which we have no choices as any kind of deterministic process. But we'll maybe park that one for the moment, unless Max wants to specifically respond to it.
No, actually, just to say, I'm sort of inclined to. I'm not certain, but I'm inclined to actually agree with Alex on that one. So, I mean, I think in epistemology, philosophers talk about this view that's known as doxastic involuntarism, and what that simply means is that we don't have voluntary control over our beliefs. So pick any belief, pick any proposition or statement that you believe to be false. The moon is made of cheese. See if you can will yourself to voluntarily believe that the moon is made of cheese, and you can't do it. And so, yeah, I'm actually probably with Alex on the thought that the way that things strike us, the way that it appears that the evidence stacks up, that's not something that we can sort of have control.
I'd love to do a separate show maybe, because someone else, another philosopher you guys may know, Philip Goff, who's been on the show before, he sent me a paper by another philosopher who has actually done some work in this and thinks there is a case for why we do need freedom to be able to assent to
interested to hear that,
the evidence as it's presented to us. But anyway, that's a little bit of a digression.
Although I do think it's relevant in the sense of like if you're willing to concede this idea that you can have rational decision-making processes that are essentially deterministic, that are just kind of causal, just cause and effect working, rather than anything else, anything supernatural, anything more than just the causal relation between the propositions presented to somebody and the methods of the brain by which they come to believe them, then I think there's perhaps an analogy here with the way that I'm thinking about rational thought in general. I mean, it's important to me because I don't just think that we don't have free will. I think that we can't have free will. I think it's an incoherent concept. And so if we can kind of take instances where somebody doesn't have free will and show that there's still rationality, I think this would apply in all cases. I think the same logic applies, if you see what I mean. It's like the idea of having a deterministic, causal, naturalistic process that convinces you of propositions that we would have no trouble calling rational, despite realizing that it isn't something we control, it isn't something that has any kind of other agency as a part of it. I think that reason and rationality can essentially just be defined as acting in accordance with what's true of the world. Now, how we might know that we're doing so is a difficult question, but the ability to do so on a naturalistic worldview, I think, is certainly not ruled out.
Would you want to respond to that?
Just briefly. I mean, what I want to say about that is I think it's important not to assume that non-physical mental causation must be indeterministic. So I'm quite happy with saying, now, for the purposes of this debate, I'm sort of agnostic about whether there's libertarian free will. Nothing I say will depend on it. But I think what's really key is the argument I'm going to defend doesn't hinge on sort of saying that determinism is incompatible with intentionality and rationality. Rather, it's that the sort of building blocks that you get if you have a physicalist, naturalist ontology don't give you what you need in order to get things like intentionality that I think we'll come to in a minute. And so let me just grant that determinism is true, but it doesn't follow that all causation is physical causation. You can have mental causation. You could even have supernatural causation that's deterministic. And I think I can fully concede determinism for the purposes of this debate, and it doesn't affect the argument.
Let's first of all define maybe naturalism, because the argument specifically here is against naturalism being a good grounding for the act of reasoning, basically. There's also, of course, if you like, beyond that, an argument for why it also points to God. But even just if you were able to in some way refute naturalism, that would be a pretty big deal, you know, if this is what the argument actually does. Now, naturalism, do you want to give a definition of how you understand that?
I mean, I think what I'm going to say, I think is would be fairly uncontentious among philosophers who subscribe to naturalism. So I think naturalism could be defined as three theses about the basic ontological sort of makeup of reality. So the first is that the universe is a closed system of physical cause and effect. So call that the causal closure of the physical. So that just says that there are no supernatural causes. There are no non-physical mental causes in the world.
Okay.
The second thing is that all that exists ultimately has to be kind of built out of the basic building blocks of physics. Now, the naturalist, I don't think, is committed to thinking that what physics currently says is, the smallest subatomic particle. is what physics will eventually say are the basic constituents of the universe. But yeah, so I think naturalism is committed to saying that whatever, if you like, the ultimate physics says are the basic building blocks of physics, everything that exists has to ultimately be built from that.
Okay.
And then, and you could call that thesis just physicalism, I suppose. And then the third one, the third thesis would be that those basic building blocks of physics, whether they be fields or subatomic particles, whatever they are intrinsically lacking in consciousness. They lack a first-person point of view. They don't have experiences. They lack purposes and values.
So I mean, I suppose in very brief, the way I would tend to summarize that the naturalistic point of view is that all that exists ultimately is the material stuff of the universe, and that there are no, as you say, supernatural, as the term suggests, things going on beyond that. So sometimes it's almost synonymous with a physicalist or materialist view. I mean, I just want to check, is that something you personally hold? Is that the kind of where you would lay your cards if you were asked, well, what is your view?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be careful to say, I mean, naturalists will approach it differently. Some will just kind of hold to the idea that it's at least potentially possible for that kind of worldview to be coherent, or are unconvinced that there are supernatural elements. And then there are those who assert that there is nothing more than... They all kind of, for the purposes of this discussion, mean the same thing. Myself, I'm always inclined to just... to withhold assent to a belief until I can be convinced of it. So I'd rather say that I'm unconvinced of the supernatural element. Otherwise, I suppose it would be less worth my time being here.
Yeah,
as
sure.
Well.
But
it means
and I appreciate that in order for this discussion to happen, you'll kind of be advocating for a naturalist position.
But of course, in order to say that I'm unconvinced by
Yeah.
a supernatural element to the universe, I have to defend the possibility or plausibility of a
naturalistic
worldview.
account. Exactly. And if I suppose if this argument were to, let's say, convince you, Alex, hypothetically, then would that give you a little bit more reason to some more confidence in a theistic, say, view of the universe?
Well, if the argument worked and convinced me, then I'd have to renounce naturalism, and I may be inclined towards theism. Reason being, because the argument is essentially that naturalism doesn't work. And so if I'm convinced that naturalism doesn't work, then I have to become a non-naturalist. And like you say, it's another step to get to any kind of specific theism, but it's like probably the most important step, I think, when approaching at least an atheist listener.
Well, we've got about 45 minutes to convince him, Max. No, I mean, I'm sure
it's been tried before.
This will be a really interesting interaction. So, I mean, do you want to add anything in terms of your own sort of the way you now sketch out this argument, Max? And obviously, I'm going to ask you both to keep it as accessible as possible for the non-philosophers, including me, listening.
Yeah, so, okay, well, let me just say something in general about how I approach philosophical arguments about God and metaphysics. So I generally am not that fond of deductive arguments, where you have some premises that are supposed to logically entail their conclusion. And I prefer probabilistic arguments. One reason for that is just that I think with deductive arguments, it has the surface appearance of giving a certain conclusion if the premises are true, but of course actually the problem is rarely are we ever certain that the premises are true, and then the conclusion can't be more certain than the premises. So I prefer just to make the uncertainty explicit in the way we formulate the argument. So I prefer probabilistic arguments, and without going into sort of lots of detail, Bayes' theorem is the way that a lot of philosophers will kind of formulate probabilistic arguments. And so, yeah, I mean, just to give an example that has nothing to do with God, I mean, suppose that, we've got a piece of evidence, namely that the leaves on someone's lawn sort of spell out their name. And then we're considering two hypotheses. One is that the person's spouse kind of raked the leaves into this nice pattern to spell out their name. The other is that the wind did it. Now, it looks as though one of those hypotheses makes this observation of the leaves spelling out this name, one of those hypotheses makes that piece of data much more probable than the other one, and so it probabilistically confirms the spouse did it hypothesis, but not with certainty.
Sure.
It is possible that the wind did it. So that's just to say about in general how I approach these things. And so I think what I want to say is, and so that's one difference from the way Lewis wants to do it, which is more deductively. So I think, in general, when we come to questions to do with evidence for and against God, the way I like to think of it is in terms of several families of phenomena, striking phenomena about the world that we would like to try and explain. And so, think of sort of cosmological one family of phenomena would be sort of the cosmological stuff to do with that there is a universe at all, that it began to exist, and so on. Another family of phenomena would be the teleological, things like the so-called kind of fine-tuning of the constants of the universe, that sort of thing. Another family might be what you call the axiological or the moral, that we have these intuitions, that we have these objectively binding duties, and so on. And another family, and this is what we're going to be focusing on, is what you might call the noological, so phenomena having to do with the mind. Now, of course, I should add, of course, the naturalist philosopher will rightly want to bring up two other families of phenomena, namely evil and hiddenness, ambiguity of evidence concerning God, and there's a whole huge conversation to have there. But so as I said, the noological phenomena having to do with the mind are basically what I think Lewis's argument was drawing attention to some of these phenomena and pointing out that it seemed to him at least that those are difficult to account for on naturalism. So basically the way I want to do this is to sort of point to 3 or 4 phenomena that individually and taken collectively are more probable given some kind of metaphysical view where consciousness, purpose, intentionality is at sort of the base layer of reality, if you like. And of course, theism isn't the only such hypothesis. I'm sure we'll come on to this. So it's not sort of directly an argument for specifically theism. So these phenomena are more probable given a hypothesis where consciousness, purpose, value, and so on are at the base layer, as compared with on a naturalistic hypothesis, which we've just laid out, physical stuff at the base layer.
Okay.
So intentionality is one such phenomenon. So intentionality is basically the aboutness of thoughts. So just to take an example, take the word London. So we can all be thinking of the word London in our heads, and that word is about something. It's about the city in which we're having this conversation. And the basic thought is here that this property of thoughts, where thoughts are able to have representational content, they're able to be about something other than themselves, is difficult to square with this naturalist picture of what reality is made of. The thought being that, if you like, atoms swerving in the void, that's what thoughts have to be at the end of the day, if naturalism is true. Atoms swerving in the void can't be about anything. And so, and actually, this is a problem that is recognized by a number of leading naturalist philosophers. So John Searle, who's written a lot on this sort of stuff, says that so far no attempt at naturalizing intentional content has ever produced an explanation of intentional content that's remotely plausible. Now, I'm sure Alex will probably want to bring up computers, and I'll leave that for now. We can come back to that. But the basic thought here is that simply, an arrangement of atoms can no more be about the city in which we find ourselves than this table can be.
Right.
And And so that's one phenomenon that seems hard to account for, given what naturalism says the world is made of.
Before you come to the others, we're fast approaching almost our first break, so time is flying by. How would you be able to sketch the other three? And we'll start with intentionality on the other side of the break, and then see what else we can fit in as we go.
Absolutely. So the next one is what you might call mental causation. So the thought here is simply that in order to arrive at a conclusion of a chain of reasoning that is justified, if you like, thoughts need to cause each other in virtue of their propositional content. They need to cause each other in virtue of what they're about, not just in virtue of physical pushes and pulls. And given what naturalism says the world is made of, physical stuff, and given the causal closure of the physical, again, it seems just very hard to square the idea that thoughts cause one another in virtue of what they're about, as opposed to merely in virtue of physical pushes and pulls.
So it's sort of linked to the intentionality, the aboutness of thoughts.
I would say so,
how one thought that's about something causes another thought about something, if ultimately those are simply two physical events happening.
That's right. And yes, exactly. So this one is really an expansion of the first. Intentionality, you could sort of get that if you just had one thought on its own, but then this second one is about how thoughts relate to each other. And then the third one, I suppose, is this thing that Planting has talked about, and I will probably come on to this. I would endorse a more qualified version of that, but I think the key point is that it's hard to see why minds that were shaped by an unguided process of natural selection would have the capacity for, not just for kind of navigating our way around our physical environment, getting food and that kind of thing, but for doing quantum physics and metaphysics and so on.
It seems to be unreasonably kind of the level at which we're able to introspect and think seems well beyond the physical needs of evolution.
I think so, and I would, and it's not just that. I mean, you could extrapolate. Look, you need some kind of reasoning processes to navigate your way around the Sahara, or whatever, the savannah. But then it's that philosophy in particular depends on certain intuitions. It's not just about reasoning processes. You have to have some raw material. And so, that's the gist of the argument there.
And was there a fourth, or was that the...
Well, I mean, I hesitate to throw this in because it's a lot.
Let's leave it there. That's so much to respond to already then. And we'll have our hands full, I'm sure, on the other side of a quick break, as Alex wants to pick up some of those points. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back. We're talking about the argument from reason for God. Does rationality disprove naturalism? My guests today on the show are Alex O'Connor and Max Baker-Hytch.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
We're talking about the argument from reason for God today. Here on Unbelievable, my guests are Max Baker-Hytch, philosopher from Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. And he's making the case that the atheist materialist account of reality can't make sense of our ability to reason, think, understand and make arguments. Alex O'Connor, well known as the Cosmic Skeptic online, is here to respond. Okay, lots to respond to there. And I don't know where you want to begin, but maybe we'll start with this issue of intentionality that Max first brought up, which is the aboutness of thoughts, that we have thoughts that are about London, for instance, and in what sense can something that ultimately is reducible to a physical thing, atoms, electrons and so on, be about anything? As I say, huge metaphysical problem in the philosophy of mind, but where would you begin with that kind of an issue?
I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. I'm struggling almost to see the contention. I think that the capacity for abstract thought and the explanations for how that could have developed within human consciousness is not particularly controversial. And I'd also say that, for instance, there are people who are not capable of thinking about London, namely people who've never heard of London and never experienced London. In other words, the thoughts that we have that are about things are predicated on our experience of these things, right? An evolutionary account of how we've come to develop our cognitive faculties would be perfectly in line with this view of reality, that There is a selective advantage in being able to think abstractly. There is a selective advantage about being able to remember things that we've experienced and think about them when they're not immediately in our face. It's clear to see how these things could be evolutionarily selected for. And this is why I think this actually ties into the last argument that was made, which I think is the most interesting one, about how if things came about through naturalistic processes, it seems that we would have selected for survival rather than for truth, right? Like, why would
this was Alvin Plantinga's famous evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Well, we don't, as we've discussed, we don't evolve to do quantum physics, but it's like, I think that's evidenced by the fact that we are currently trying to use reason to overcome our naturalistic approach to something like quantum physics, and our intuitions that we have, our psychological intuitions that have come about through our biological evolution. It's clear to see why we are not able to understand the unimaginably small and the unimaginably large in science, because we didn't evolve for those purposes. However, we're using reason to overcome that, right? It's not that isn't. We're not saying that kind of we've evolved the ability to talk about quantum physics. We're saying that we've really evolved the inability to do so, and we're trying to use reason to overcome that. I think that there is selective advantage to truth in many ways, but I can understand why people would have the contention that because selection is governed by survival rather than truth, we'd be wary to trust it. But this is where I want to also come back on what you said, Max, about deductive arguments. I think, do you mean to say when you talk about reason not really working on a naturalistic worldview, that deductive arguments themselves would also not work? Because another problem with deductive arguments, not so much a problem, but an interesting observation, is that they essentially provide no new information. They are tautological in nature, right? You have two premises and you have a conclusion, and the fact that the conclusion logically follows means that the conclusion just has the same semantic value as the two premises put together, right? So you've just got a tautology. So to say that that doesn't work on a naturalistic worldview is to say that tautologies don't work on a naturalistic worldview. That is, something like P is P could not be kind of justifiably, reasonably true on a naturalistic worldview. To me, I'm one of those people who's of the opinion that the laws of logic are almost somewhat transcendent in a sense of like their necessary truth, right? I think there are certain things that we can know a priori, and I think that the laws of logic are an example of that. Do you think that if naturalism were true, we could trust deductive arguments?
Yeah. Okay, so there's quite a lot to respond to there. So yeah, let me start with deduction. So so I mean I share the view of most philosophers that the laws of logic hold in all possible worlds. They couldn't have been different. So in one sense, deduction works in a naturalistic universe just as well as in a theistic universe. But the issue there is our capacity to acquire knowledge via deduction. And so that basically, in order to acquire knowledge of a conclusion of a deductive argument, you need to know the truth of the premises, and you need to know the validity of the entailment, right?
So give us an example, just a trivial one, you know.
So sure. So all human beings are mortal, premise one. Socrates is mortal, premise two.
Socrates is a human.
Socrates is a human, premise two. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Yeah. So I mean, it doesn't matter whether or not theism is true for that argument to be deductively valid and sound. But the key issue here is our capacity to recognize the deductive validity of an argument like that. And I think this goes to a deeper issue, really. So Alex, you maybe I didn't use the best example with the word London, but I mean, I think the point here is supposed to be quite a fundamental one. It's not just the capacity for abstract thought. It's the capacity for any thought whatsoever to have any representational content whatsoever. And you said that evolution, gives us accounts of how cognition would have developed. And I don't really dispute that, but I think the key point is those evolutionary models are silent on these metaphysical questions of, yes.
Just to be able to kind of then just present this in a package and allow Alex to respond to it. So let's say, that taking that argument, all humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay. So the person sort of thinking about that, reasoning that through, they're having to have thoughts about Socrates being human. They've got to have a thought about all humans being mortal. And so at the first level, from what I heard you saying earlier, Max, the point is how do these physical events in our brain map onto something being about someone, about Socrates, about his mortality, and so on. And then secondly, how do we see, if you like, that those two things together entail the conclusion? And that again is a linked but different issue in this kind of causation as you see it. You know, why does one physical event entail this other different physical event, but it's actually the content of those thoughts. And so should we pass the ball back to Alex?
Yes, that's helpful. Thanks, Justin. That's good.
I mean, there are two important and separable questions. The first being knowledge of like the premises, but secondly, as you say, knowledge of the validity of the inference. I would say that, as I say, deductive arguments are just tautological, meaning that what we're talking about is an ability to recognize that two things are the same, right? It's an ability in the same way that like if you have two thoughts that are just identical in content, if you have, the bus is red, therefore the bus is red, to ask about how we could know that that's a valid inference seems a bit strange. It's like, surely we're just talking about the ability to recognize that two things are the same. It's not really about a relationship between them. It's about just recognizing a similarity. And I think that's what's going on in a deductive argument. When we say that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, we are saying that Socrates is mortal. It's essentially just a linguistic feature that we separate these into two premises and ultimately a conclusion. And we say that we derive the conclusion. I think that we derive the conclusion linguistically, but what we're actually just doing is reframing the premises into a new form that that is a helpful thing to do for philosophy, because we can then kind of build upon those conclusions as well. But that's what I think we're talking about, is just a recognition that two things are the same. I don't know if you agree with that.
Does that?
So I'm this idea that all deductive arguments are tautologies. I mean, I think that there's a good deal of philosophers who would not be particularly happy with that way of characterizing deductive arguments. I mean, I think so the thing is, the premises of that. So to boil it down, actually, what the argument that we've just been discussing, the example, has the following form. P is the first premise. If P, then Q, therefore Q. So that's what's known as modus ponens. And the validity of that rule is, this would get us quite take us quite far afield into philosophy of logic and so on. But that inference rule, known as modus ponens, that says, P, then P, if P then Q, therefore Q. That inference rule itself is something that we have to somehow grasp with our minds in order to come to a justified belief in the conclusion. And so I don't think, to say it's a tautology makes it sound like, let's suppose it is, but that doesn't really help us understand this thing that I've been alluding to, is this question of, well, how, if thoughts are atoms swerving in the void, is it the case that those atoms are about modus ponens?
Yeah, I suppose for me that's the central point here.
But
I feel like
I think it's not to say that the atoms are about something is to kind of it's using something of a reverse fallacy of composition, it seems to me, to be saying that everything's made up of atoms, therefore thoughts must be, if a thought is about London, it must just be atoms about London in some sense. It's like, I think it's in the same way as saying like a book is made of atoms, but a book can be about London despite the atoms of the book being made up of not about London, if you see what I'm saying, right? So like we're talking about a naturalistic process which has given rise to something which can attach itself to abstract thought. We're not talking about the process itself and the building blocks upon which it's based being the thing that does the thinking, right? It's just as like an atom is not self-replicating, to kind of, because when we talk about consciousness and it kind of muddies the waters because it becomes a bit difficult to think about. But with any other evolutionary process, we can recognize, an atom is not self-replicating, but you put enough atoms together in the right sort of way and you get a cell that's self-replicating. And that's that's not a problem. Like, I wouldn't turn around and say, but like, it makes no sense on a naturalistic worldview to say that a cell is self-replicating, because if it's made of nothing more than atoms, then how can an atom kind of bring about that process?
I mean, what I'm hearing from you, Alex, is, of course, this electron banging into that electron doesn't equal a thought about London or Socrates. But when you have a complex brain structure that's doing all kinds of clever things, that is a kind of emergent property, to use one of the...
Just as to mention computers, as you briefly mentioned earlier, if you're somebody who believes in the concept of artificial intelligence, that we can have computers that essentially can think about things in an electronic sense, right? And they're not thinking about things in a conscious sense, but we're not talking here about being necessarily aware of the thoughts we're having, but just the capability of thoughts to be had about these things. Like, it's a similar kind of process going on in the brain. It's just that it's made of biological stuff instead of electronic stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, you brought up books, and that's a little bit similar to the case of computers in a way, in the following sense. So I mean, I think you made the point that a book is made of atoms. I would agree with that, and yet a book is about lots of stuff, presumably. Doesn't that show that a thing that is basically built out of physical stuff can have intentionality? And I think that the response there would be simply that the intentionality, if we want to call it that, of books and code in a computer is a derived intentionality.
Yeah, it comes from their maker, right?
Yeah, right. So I mean, take an example of Deep Blue, the chess computer, and it makes a certain move. The move to the computer itself has no meaning. It's a string of presumably of ones and zeros, but within a framework that we confer on, on the move has meaning. And John Searle actually kind of made this point with what's known as the sort of Chinese room analogy. And the idea there is basically, imagine yourself, suppose that you don't know Chinese, but you're sitting in a room where someone's feeding Chinese characters into the room, and you've been given a set of rules of if it's this character, then it goes into this box, and you can do this all day. And the thought is essentially that's what a computer is doing on a very complex level. But the computer, there is no meaning or intentionality for the person.
The computer isn't thinking, I need to do this to do that. Yeah. It's simply following a set of instructions, essentially.
That's right. And which
we have imbued with meaning.
Yeah. So any appearance of intentionality is there solely in virtue of our intentionality. And so then you're back to the problem that we started with, which is how to account for our intentionality.
So there's an interesting point which to...
But I'm interested in order to discuss this properly, I'm interested in kind of dispelling of a potential double standard that people might see in the escape from these kind of problems by referring to supernaturalism and God, which is that, to me, is it not the case that you need to presuppose reason in order to come up with the justification that you're coming up with for reason, if you see what I mean. I mean, if you're going to say that we can have reason because of the fact that we're going to ground it in supernaturalism, we're going to ground it in God, don't you need to presuppose reason in order to reason that that's the case?
Yeah, so right, that's a fair question, I think, and I think this actually comes up particularly the Alvin Plantinga argument that we alluded to earlier, which says, and the way he frames it, I think actually does raise this question that Alex brings up, because he wants to say if you're a naturalist, then you should sort of doubt your reason, in a nutshell. But then you think, well, but didn't the naturalists need to presuppose their reason to follow Plantinga's argument to get this conclusion that they should distrust their reason? And that looks a bit funky.
But it's not just that, because obviously Plantinga can say that, like, I can justify using reason as a whole. What I'm saying specifically is about from the very beginning. It's like, let's say that we're trying to justify reason. It's like, you can't even begin having that conversation at all.
Yeah.
Unless you presuppose the conclusion that reason is and the thing is, like, if you're then also saying, if the argument is going to be that the only way you can have reason is through some kind of supernatural agency, then not only do you have to presuppose reason, but you have to presuppose supernatural agency before you even begin the conversation.
Okay, so I think what I want to say to that is that, so the way I'm not formulating this argument in the way Plantinga formulates his, so there's basically two different ways to do this. One is to say, look, it's sort of an open question whether we have reason or not. And given naturalism, you're sort of required to give up on it. And I think implicitly you're taking issue with that, because of course one has to presuppose reason to go through those steps. Now, I want to say that's not the way I'm framing this. So then there's a different way of approaching it, which is to say, look, here's the data. The data is that we have intentionality, the ability to make inferences. We can both agree on that. And then the question is, which hypothesis best accounts for that data, best predicts it? And so that does presuppose the data of reason, but not in a circular way. And that's a very kind of standard way now, I think, of formulating arguments in philosophy of religion. So we might do the same with, let's say, the fine-tuning of the universe. The way it works is roughly we both agree to some set of physical, empirical data, and then the question is which hypothesis best explains this. And so we do presuppose certain data.
So you're both agreeing reasoning happens.
Yes.
Reasoning exists. Is it does it comport best with a naturalistic or theistic or some other worldview?
So what I'm not doing is saying Alex should stop thinking he can reason.
Oh, of course. So I think you're entitled to that's the
but
the
you're
way
questioning
in which
whether the naturalistic worldview can
is the
ground
best
such
hypothesis.
a
Yes,
thing.
that's right.
I mean, I don't know if you want to keep going on that.
Well, I can give it a go.
Go ahead.
I think the principal objection to saying that a process like natural selection cannot, because it's such a kind of simple, all-encompassing thesis. It's like anything that can't be explained by religion. It seems natural selection has something to say about it, but it seems here, no, it's different, because we're talking about ontological truths. We're not talking about survival value or complexity or anything like that. It's about something more abstract than that. Well, okay, so the argument might go something like this. If you hear a noise in a bush, as is the common example given, it's evolutionarily advantageous to believe that it's a threat, and kind of have this instinctual running away, even though that's false, right? We evolved to have that kind of instinct. Well, this is true, and you could say that means that we've evolved to kind of be believing perhaps potentially false things because they are beneficial for our survival. But I don't think that's entirely true. For instance, if we evolve an instinct to run away from loud noises, that isn't attached to beliefs about ontological truths, right? That's not necessarily attached to a belief that there's something going on in that bush, right? And in fact, if I hear a noise behind me right now, I'll jump because of my evolutionary history. But when I turn around and look at it, then I'm able to see that that's not what's actually happened. I'll become convinced that that's not the case. Reason being that if we put to the side like epistemological skepticism for the moment, let's just kind of grant that our senses are accurate here. The person who, when investigating things, not just kind of their instinctual reactions, but when investigating what they see around them, gets it correct, sees that does actually poison this human being, that does actually cause a danger to whatever it may be, this does actually improve health or whatever it may be, that would almost trivially be selected for. Of course, evolution is going to select for the brains which are able to look at the things around them, recognize what's real about the world. And then what we have is the coupling of this. This is why I asked earlier, and I want to come back to it because I didn't quite finish the thought, I think, about deduction and the validity of deduction even in a naturalistic universe. It's like, if we can grant, as I say, we have to put aside epistemological skepticism, because you could say, well, how can you even trust your senses? But I could say the same thing about anybody here. So we're just going to grant that for the time being and say that if there are things that I see and observe in nature, and I can start making kind of comparisons and realizing that there are kind of tautological inferences to be made, that's the beginning of rationality, right? And that's something that would be selected for. And although natural selection is selecting for survival, the most kind of consistent way to ensure the survival of a conscious agent is its ability to realistically understand the world around it.
It sounds like you're saying it's perfectly consistent that our ability to reason would confer advantages on us. That evolution's perfectly happy to want.
It's
to,
true, but we have to be clear to make sure that people aren't thinking that I'm suggesting that evolution selects for truth, because I certainly don't think it does.
Given that evolution selects for survival
yes.
and for your genes being propagated in the future, it seems to you that a reasoning functionality in the brain arising would be a very advantageous thing to happen for a person.
Yes,
to be able to make for broadly speaking, to develop true beliefs about the world is a kind of
yes. I think it doesn't select for truth, but it selects for minds that
will survive.
That will act in accordance with the truth. If you know what I mean. And I think the definition of reason is acting and thinking in accordance with truth. And to survive, you have to act in accordance with the truth of the material world around you.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, I think what I want to emphasize, we need to sort of separate out some of this data here, because on the one hand, we've been talking about its intentionality and mental causation, and this question of, can you have this if thoughts are basically made out of physical stuff? And then there's this question of, could natural selection select for brains that are good at reasoning?
And that's a bit of a further down the stream kind of question.
That's right, because I think I don't think you're talking about now. I think I can grant the plausibility of some of what you're saying about evolution. Selecting for sort of capacities to classify various things and say, well, if something falls in this category, then it's probably going to have this property. But all of that is predicated on the assumption that there is even this capacity for thoughts to be about stuff whatsoever. So evolution doesn't explain intentionality. Evolutionary psychology presupposes intentionality. I think that's a very key point.
So the real question, I mean, the most fundamental question, as much as it's interesting to discuss Alvin Plantinga's argument, is the fact we can think at all, the fact we can have thoughts about things. Max is saying just at that point you've got a problem with the naturalistic account. How do we conceive of the idea that physical atoms, electrons and stuff are in fact giving rise to these thoughts about things, which it's the classic kind of mind-body problem, I think, at some level, which is how does a physical thing produce a sensation or this intentionality in this case about something? And
seems to me that we're kind of talking about the development of consciousness here. We're talking about the development of some kind of faculty for, as you say, thinking about things. But maybe I'm just misunderstanding why this needs to be so complicated. I mean, like the development, let's say we framed it in terms of the development of memory. I think when you talk about consciousness, people think of it as this kind of crazy, mysterious kind of cloak over our knowledge. But if we just talk about something like memory, it seems a lot more straightforward. I think it wouldn't be too difficult to explain how our faculty for memory might develop. But when we're talking about thoughts being about things, we're essentially talking about recall. We're essentially talking about observing things and being able to recall them in the mind, right? Like, why does this have to be some kind of different category of evolutionary development to the development of fingers, if you see what I mean?
Well, so I think...
And that's a genuine question rather than an argument.
Right, so I mean, intentionality isn't just about recall. I mean, it's literally about any kind of thought whatsoever. So, and it can be a thought about a fictional object like a unicorn. The point is not whether the object is one I'm observing currently or have observed in the past. The point is more fundamental than that. It's that very capacity for stuff in my head to represent something, whether that thing be fictional or real, past or present. And so in terms of so let me use an analogy. I think, in a sense, evolutionary psychology, and by the way, I don't dispute all of its hypotheses, but evolutionary psychology is sort of about saying, when you've got these bricks, which are, if you like, sort of capacity for human thoughts, full stop. You've got these bricks, and then how do they get arranged into this very impressive building? Evolutionary psychology, the sorts of theories you've been alluding to about the development of the mind as shaped by natural selection, in essence, all that's getting at is, once you've got the bricks, how do they then get arranged? It doesn't touch that question of how you get the bricks in the first place.
And so we're going to go to our next break, but I feel like we've kind of hit a kind of the rock bottom kind of question at the bottom of this, which is how do our thoughts, if they are ultimately constituted by physical things, atoms, electrons, and so on, how do they manifest, if you like, in our consciousness as thoughts about things, which seems necessary for reason to happen, for something to entail another thing. That's the second kind of mystery in this, is how does having a thought about one thing and a thought about another thing, and when you connect them, create a third thought. Because what I'm getting from you, Max, is that if you were just looking at what's going on in the brain at that point, this electron goes here, that electron goes there, you would not see anything that looks like what the actual experience of us reasoning is in that sense. And maybe that's just where I'll leave it, and then we'll go to our break and come back to Alex to continue this. Fascinating discussion, quite a deep dive today. It's taken us off in different directions, actually. I'm enjoying the way we've gone into evolution and other parts of the spectrum here. But we're at the core of this, we're looking at an argument popularized in many ways by C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles, the argument from reason against naturalism. And we'll continue with my guests, Alex and Max, very shortly.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
So welcome back to the final part of this discussion between my guests Max Baker-Hytch and Alex O'Connor. Do check out Max online. He is a tutor over at the Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. You can find some of his academic papers if you just search for his name, and I'm sure you'll find some interesting stuff there. Alex has tons of content on the YouTube channel he runs, Cosmic Skeptic. Really fascinating discussions and dialogues on there as well. But cosmicskeptic.com takes you to the sort of the central page for exploring that. I appreciate both of you coming in to do this quite sort of abstract, conceptual kind of discussion. Sometimes I've been trying to kind of I think put a bit of flesh on it, because I think so often if someone's watching or listening, they can think, okay, I think I get that, but how does that work? And what it's kind of boiled down to in the end, I feel like, Alex, is a sort of that classic question of how does physical stuff produce consciousness or the aboutness of our thoughts. And this is a debate we've kind of done with other people like Daniel Dennett and many others over the years. But it seems quite fundamental to this argument from reason, because it's that classic problem of if at the bottom of all of this there's physical stuff going on, where does the aboutness of these thoughts come from? Which then produces this entailment problem potentially and everything else.
But
so
this problem, I mean, this problem, as you say, it's just kind of like it's just the question of how we get from natural explanations to talking about minds, right? And this is why I bring up something like memory. I feel like it's analogous, if not strictly relevant, because it's like it seems to be kind of a different category of stuff. Something like memory, it's like brain process, it's mind process. It seems to have more agency behind it, but it's not a controversial thing to say that can arise from naturalistic processes. And as we were just briefly discussing in the break, it's like we don't fully understand, or perhaps never will fully understand the brain. It's the most complex thing we've ever discovered in the universe, right? And like there are areas such as this which are a bit hazy, but it seems to me that our naturalistic explanations of the brain are quite sufficient to explain most of its phenomena. And even if it can't quite explain consciousness, which many people will claim that it can, but even if it can't, like I think that then just almost becomes an argument from I don't know what the exact term to use here would be, perhaps an argument from ignorance, perhaps an argument
and if you're pushing it in the direction of God, a God of the gaps, essentially,
I suppose so. But it's not quite, because I mean, you're not just kind of saying this is God. You're talking about kind of an unexplained area of psychology and hypothesizing some kind of supernatural agency. I think that's perhaps a step that we don't need to take, or we're a bit too hasty to take. I think that we should just recognize that, like, I mean, for instance, perhaps to wrap up that kind of part of the discussion, do you think it's possible for a process of thought and thinking about things and intentionalism, this kind of stuff, to arise from naturalistic processes? Do you think it's possible at all? Like, do you think it's like conceivably possible in principle?
No. So I think that given how we've defined naturalism earlier in the program, that the basic resources that you have to if you like, to build conscious, and actually we haven't talked about conscious experience itself, which I would say is actually one layer more fundamental than intentionality, just that the existence of a first person subjective perspective. I'm glad to hear you sort of be open at least to thinking that we don't have an explanation for that, at least currently. But yeah, I mean, what I want to say there is it's not a sort of claim that we don't yet sort of know the mechanism or the arrangement. We don't fully understand the arrangement of physical stuff that you would need to get this first person perspective and then this aboutness. It is something more fundamental than that, namely that the ingredients that naturalism gives us are not, they don't enable us to build that kind of stuff. The physical stuff, which has no first-person perspective, is no matter how you combine it, no matter how complex the arrangement, that physical stuff is never going to produce a first-person perspective. If the
I see what you mean. I think that's perhaps the difference then, because to me, I've had a lot of conversations with people about this topic of like how something like awareness can arise, and perhaps we should have discussed that, because I think it's really interesting and something I've been reading a lot about, specifically in relation to non-human animals and whether they have awareness too. It seems to me that like you can have a process by which if an object or an organism or a molecule or something begins to kind of react to its environment in a purely naturalistic sense, we can begin to see what we might call the origins of self-awareness, like an ability to react to an environment. You can understand why it would be more advantageous if, as well as being able to kind of, so let's say that you kind of like the flower that follows the sun across the sky, that kind of thing. It's like that's obviously not a kind of that's not evidence of self-awareness. But if we talk about the development of faculty like that, we can see why it would be beneficial to have not just a kind of not just a what you might call an instinctual reaction, which is essentially what it would be, to kind of a desire to do so, developing the experiences of pleasure and pain, right? And if you develop the experience for pain, then you can develop the experience of desires, and so on and so forth, and the complexity just kind of keeps building, and awareness can be seen on this kind of gradual scope. We don't need to see it as a kind of on-off switch, right? And if we do, then I think it would be the on-off switch of pain and pleasure, which is a fairly simple thing to explain evolutionarily, if you see what I'm saying. I think that kind of looking at it in a grand scheme of kind of the evolution of basic awareness of our surroundings, reactions to our surroundings, and how that can just become more complex to involve pleasure and pain and then desire, and then see how that would again, that's talking about like awareness specifically. You then have to make a further kind of added complexity of abstract thought.
But I think, do you think there's something in that narrative of, okay, you start with something very simple, like just an organism, a single cell organism that doesn't want to go into that, that has some kind of instinctual reaction to something. Eventually, with enough complexity and time, you can get abstract thought at the end of that process.
So I don't think anything I've said commits me to denying gradualism, if you like. That of course, there's a spectrum of levels of consciousness, conscious awareness. But I think that the point I want to make and we haven't really talked about conscious awareness itself. We've more talked about intentionality, which kind of presupposes conscious awareness. But conscious awareness itself is an interesting puzzle, and it's not just theists who think this. A number of leading philosophers of mind, like David Chalmers, Tim Crane, Thomas Nagel, would say that they think that qualia, first-person subjective experience, even if that's the first-person subjective experience of a fly, if flies have that, I don't know whether they do, that does seem to be just a different kind of thing from brain states. And there are various philosophical arguments that it would take us too long to get into that sort of underscore this point, that this first person what it's like to feel pain or whatever is just a different kind of thing from what happens when neurons fire in the brain. And so I think just talking about how things unfold gradually doesn't really touch that question of why there is this first person subjective perspective. And I would add, I think it's particularly a puzzle if you subscribe to this idea that physical states and events are causally sufficient to explain everything that happens in the world. And as we sort of discussed earlier, I think that is one of the sort of tenets of naturalism. Because then you have this puzzle. Why does there need to be? I mean, you talked about selective advantage, Alex. Now, what I think I'd be happy to grant is that there's selective advantage in my brain being in certain states that make my body move in certain ways that get me to do stuff. But then if the physical stuff that's happening in the brain is causally sufficient, why does there need to be, from an evolutionary point of view, this other quite different thing, this first-person subjective perspective? So philosophers of mind would say that, if you're committed to this idea of causal closure, physical causes are sufficient to account for everything, including our behavior. Consciousness would have to be an epiphenomenon, a bit like the steam that comes off a kettle. It's not causally necessary to explain our behavior. So I think you've got this further puzzle of why would this physical stuff...
I think it makes a lot of sense to just say that an understanding of an organism's own place within its environment and its community is kind of has seemingly obvious advantages, but also, even if it doesn't, if it were just an offshoot, of course, evolution doesn't necessarily like stop the production of useless things, right? Like you can have side effects, you can have things that aren't harmful that just happen to be there. If that's the case, then the fact that the argument that I could make for the development of justified reason in human beings might be an evolutionary offshoot, but that doesn't affect the truth of whether of its accuracy or not. If you know what I mean, like sure, maybe it is just an offshoot, but that doesn't mean that it's not an accurate offshoot. Doesn't mean that it doesn't actually hold to the truth.
We'll do a quick response, and then I just want to wrap up with the kind of question of whether it takes us in the direction of God.
I just want to make sure that people are aware, like what this seems to suggest to me is that in order to kind of undermine the argument that you're making, all that people really have to believe is that it is possible to naturally evolve conscious processes, right? That seems to be the kind of crux of the point. And I wasn't talking about gradation that leads to conscious awareness, but the gradation of conscious awareness. And I think that if a listener can agree that it's plausible that conscious awareness and ultimately feelings of pleasure and pain and this kind of stuff can evolve from naturalistic causes, then they can disagree with the argument that you're making. I think, would that perhaps be the way to disagree with you here then?
So I want to say no, because this is a probabilistic argument. This is about which hypothesis makes the data more likely or not. So, my earlier example of the leaves on the lawn, it's possible, it's physically possible, it's logically possible as well, for the leaves to be arranged to spell out the person's name.
By the wind.
Right, by the wind, sorry, thanks Justin. But the question is which hypothesis predicts this data more strongly, and merely to say it's possible in some sense, which I think I might be willing to grant, it is conceivable that evolution throws up this unnecessary offshoot, namely subjective experience. That doesn't show that the naturalistic hypothesis makes this data at all likely, and that's really the key question here.
I mean, do you feel then that overall, as you understand this argument, Max, obviously that it comports more with the theistic view then, presumably your view is if naturalism can't account for this phenomena, we're in a better position to say there's something that underlies this physical world that is a divine mind, essentially.
Well, yeah, and so I want to be quite cautious about the significance of this argument. So I think I don't want to say it's directly an argument for theism. I think it's an argument for a family of hypotheses, among which, of which theism is a member. So, I mean, I think it's first and foremost an argument for thinking that mental stuff, intentionality, conscious awareness, and so on, has to be at the base layer of reality. Now, there are, as you both well know, there are other views of reality besides theism, which would say that consciousness, intentionality, and so on are at the base layer of reality. So, I mean, then I think it's a further step to then say, well, of those various hypotheses, those various non-naturalistic hypotheses, which one is the best?
Yeah. So you do kind of have to produce further argument for why
I think so.
it isn't some kind of Platonic realm that exists.
That's right. And I think it's notable, that someone like Thomas Nagel, who's definitely not a believer in God, nonetheless, I think wants to say that qualia, conscious experience, intentionality, purpose, and so on, are metaphysically fundamental. They're at the base layer, but that base layer isn't conceived of as a personal God for him. And I don't want to sort of say that kind of view is totally out of the question.
It's interesting because I've met increasingly a number of people, even well-known people like Philip Pullman. I remember when I had him on the show, well-known as an atheist, a writer, and so on, but said he disagrees with the naturalistic hypothesis. He believes that there's a kind of a consciousness that exists at the bottom of everything, and he says, some of his atheist colleagues, Dawkins and so on, really disagree with him on that. But that's his perspective on how he then makes sense of the objective, the purpose, and the kind of the consciousness that he obviously feels is important. I mean, you've come on to sort of defend a naturalistic position to some extent.
Essentially, I suppose I just need to defend its plausibility, and I think that you talk about like making an argument from probability, which is true, but you can essentially turn it into a deductive argument by saying that the hypothesis is like, it's more probable that this is the case, and if it's more probable that this is the case, then we should believe it, right? It's essentially what we're saying. I guess the question is, what is a more probable explanation of the development of self-consciousness, and especially taking into consideration the way in which it seems to have come about in human beings, which is through a process of long and gradual evolution. It's like, what would we expect to see if we were to assume a naturalistic explanation for the development of conscious thought? Well, we'd probably expect to see a slightly not fully understood but very long and very complex process upon which there was much trial and error. Probably some forms of life which didn't quite get there and didn't manage to develop conscious awareness. Maybe some forms of life that did develop conscious awareness but didn't quite manage it in the same way that we do and don't have a capacity for rational thought as we do. And eventually kind of something that manages to kind of land on it and get it right, and based on that is able to benefit their own survival such that they become the most important species or at the top of the kind of hierarchy of power. That's probably what we'd expect to see. And that seems to be what we observe. If we were taking a theistic or supernatural, I should say, view of the development of consciousness, I don't know that we'd expect it to evolve in that way. And so when you talk about what's more probable, it's like, I've got no problem with making a probabilistic argument, but I'd say that there's at least an argument to be made that it's more probable, or rather, I should say that it is a more plausible explanation for the way that consciousness seems to have developed. That it's come from natural causes rather than it's come from any kind of divine or supernatural agency.
Quick response, and then we'll wrap things up.
In terms of, there's two bits there. How probable is the development of consciousness as we see it in our world, given naturalism, and how probable is it, or would it be, given theism? So I think we basically don't get to assign a high probability to this emergence of consciousness given naturalism, unless you can show why. I mean, I suppose really to reiterate what I said earlier, if you're committed to the causal closure of the physical, that's to say physical goings on are fully causally sufficient to explain everything, including our behavior, what you would expect on naturalism, let's just say, is the development of more and more complex brains that allow creatures in more and more sophisticated ways to move around their environments. But again, given the causal closure of the physical, there is no reason whatsoever to expect those brain processes, however complex they may be, to be accompanied by first-person conscious awareness. And I don't think I've yet heard a reason. Now, we can both agree, I think, that it's logically possible that it do so, but that's not a reason for assigning it a high probability at all. And then in terms of the development of consciousness on theism, I mean, and you make the point that what we do see in our world is a rather gradual development of conscious awareness, and I'd fully grant that. I suppose then, this gets more into questions of to what extent would we expect God to create a world sort of through a slow unfolding process, as opposed to sort of ex nihilo in one go, us here, complex creatures as we are, just kind of from nothing. And I suppose all I'd say there is it's not obvious to me at all that we would have a strong expectation that God would do it in the sort of all in one go, as opposed to the gradual way of doing things. I mean, but of course this gets tricky in terms of assessing what God would do. I mean, and I think certainly in the sort of, and we haven't at all talked about Christian theism in this program so far, but I mean, I think we do to assess God's intentions, we do have to get into specific versions of theism, because they will make different predictions. But yeah, I think the kind of biblical portrait of God is of a God who sometimes does stuff in an instant, but I would almost say more often does things through unfolding narratives and processes. And so then that would lead me to not be too surprised if that was how he were to create conscious life.
I mean, that's a subject for a whole other program potentially. But,
yeah, I mean that's just it's essentially just a common objection you hear all the time. Why would God have done it this way? I mean, specifically when it comes to the development of consciousness, I'm interested in kind of I'm talking specifically about the way that consciousness evolved, not the fact that it evolved over a long time rather than popping into existence. I'm talking about the mechanisms by which it evolved seem to be more in line with naturalism than supernaturalism. But you're right. I mean, it is.
Well, we'll have to leave that one there because we're out of time. But it's been a really great conversation. Thank you both. As I say, you can find out more about Max and indeed C.S. Lewis's argument from reason and the way that Max has developed it if you go and look for his name. I'll make sure there's a link from today's show in the info accompanying this program. And Alex O'Connor is available, of course, as the Cosmic Skeptic on YouTube and at the website, and I'll make sure there are links too. But fascinating discussion from you. Thank you very much for coming in and doing a deep dive with me on this particular argument. And hopefully I'll get you both back again at some point in the future.
Anytime.
Thank you very much, both of you.